Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 12 letters of support for this legislation from states, NGOs, and advocacy groups.
Without objection.
Director Cabrera, thanks again for joining us today. I want to ask you to expand upon your testimony. You mentioned that 120 stream miles are considered impaired under the Clean Water Act due to abandoned mine sites. Now, how many of these streams are tributaries of the watersheds that provide most of Arizona's drinking water, like the Colorado River, the Salt River, the Verde River, and the Gila River?
Senator Kelly, thank you for the question. Of the 120 impaired stream miles, 93 of those miles are in watersheds of these major Arizona rivers. And while none of these stream miles are directly used for drinking water, they're all in the watershed. And as the drought continues and the assimilative capacity of our rivers and streams is reduced, in other words, the flow is reduced, so its ability to accept pollution and contamination is also reduced. It becomes a much larger problem for all of our limited drinking water sources. That's why the Arizona legislature a number of years ago produced a joint resolution led by Representative Griffin to recommend to Congress that we pass abandoned mine legislation.
So 93 out of 120 of these streams go into these rivers where drinking water comes from. That's about 78% of those. So that's significant. And can you briefly discuss the risks posed by abandoned mine sites to our groundwater aquifers? Are there any sites which pose a particular acute risk to groundwater, which is used for drinking water?
Thank you, Senator. One thing to understand about the state of Arizona is that every drop of aquifer is considered a drinking water source. That's actually very rare in the United States, but we're a desert region and water is very precious. And so for the most part, for us, groundwater equals drinking water. One example in the state of Arizona is a site that was studied by the Arizona Department of Health Services because it had high levels of metals in groundwater in a rural location where lots of private individuals were using that groundwater as a primary drinking water source. That particular site we are working with, and we're trying to address the surface water contamination that then seeps into the groundwater sources. So it is a very real risk to our aquifers and groundwater. And again, in the state of Arizona, all of our groundwater, for the most part, is considered a drinking water source.
Yeah, it sounds like a serious risk to our drinking water. And as I talked about previously, this is going on at a time when we're preparing to do more with less water from the Colorado River. So we need to ensure that other sources of drinking water, our groundwater, is protected. Director Cabrera, I understand that ADEQ has identified some of the most at-risk orphan mine sites and is working with the landowners on remediation. Can you explain how CERCLA and the Clean Water Act pose challenges when working with landowners to address these abandoned sites?
Yes, Senators. For many abandoned mine sites, there are no existing responsible parties for the contamination. Instead, there are often private landowners without means or knowledge to address the issue, or the sites are on public lands. And so private landowners in particular often bought without knowledge a legacy site, and they never created the problems that were created a century ago. Now, why that's problematic is because under the Superfund law, CERCLA, which we've mentioned, there are 4 types of potentially responsible parties. There's current owners and operators, there's past owners and operators, There's generators and parties that arrange for the disposal or transport of the hazardous substances. And then there's transporters of hazardous waste that selected the site where the hazardous substances were brought. In a 2015 report on cleanup of abandoned mine lands, the Congressional Research Service states that at least two, in my opinion, more likely three of those categories might apply to Good Samaritans or innocent landowners who attempt to clean up an inactive or abandoned mine. Now, circular liability in particular, we have to understand that it's retroactive. So parties, any of those four potential responsible party categories are held liable for acts that happened before the laws even existed. The liability is joint and several, which means that any one potentially responsible party can be held liable for the entire cleanup. And it is strict. A responsible party cannot simply say that they were not negligent or that it was not their doing. And so this poses a heavy burden. These laws do a really good job of holding people accountable in the today, but what they do is they form barriers and obstacles where responsible parties who actually did the contamination are no longer available. So this set of liability provisions poses an asymmetric risk for an innocent landowner or a private party or an NGO or a volunteer or a state when the land in question is worth a fraction of the cost of cleanup. And so the risk reward becomes very, very difficult, and most parties simply choose to do nothing.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, I've got some more questions I want to submit for the record.
Absolutely, without objection.
And also, I want to just thank everybody for being here today. And Chris, nice to see you again, and appreciate everybody showing up for this to have this issue addressed. I mean, it's important we get these cleaned up. The water situation we have in the state is challenging, to say the least, and we've got to protect our groundwater from the runoff from these hard rock mines. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.